This is Reverend Kirk Lawton, minister at Ocean Lakes Family Campground, and this is our podcast. Our prayer is that this message may enrich your life as you find God especially meaningful to you. Thank you for worshiping with us. We continue this morning our series of sermons on the subject, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which we began a couple of Sundays ago. In that first sermon, we looked at the problem, and then I concluded with two statements. First, suffering is not always a direct result of sin. And second, living a righteous life does not exempt us from pain and suffering. Last Sunday, we took a close look at the subject of pain. Now, I realize that many of you who are hearing me this morning did not hear either of these previous two messages. But I hope you'll understand, and by the way, if you're on the podcast, you can back up and those two sermons are still available for you. I hope you'll understand that we are now continuing in a series of sermons. I wish so much it were possible for me to have the privilege of preaching every message to all those who might be able to hear only one or two of the sermons. I know that's not possible, however. So let's continue this morning as we look at just two verses from John's Gospel, verses 1 and 2. As Jesus and his disciples passed by one day, they came face to face with a very sad situation. They found a man who had been blind from his birth. Of all the people who should have been compassionate and helpful to such a man, it should have been the disciples of Jesus. But instead, they seemed to regard this poor man only as an opportunity for the Master to give some insight into a common theological problem of the day. These disciples had a question. It was not, Lord, how can we help this man? Rather, they asked, who's to blame for this man's blindness? Where does blindness come from? What is the origin of bad things like this? That's what the disciples wanted to know. Well, that's an important question for us to consider. If something bad happens, we feel the need to be able to assign blame and make the guilty person pay for his actions. And this ranges all the way from a scene in school, maybe where a teacher leaves a room for a minute and then returns to find a glass pitcher which was on her desk, now in many pieces on the floor. Her first question is, who did this? In a much more serious dimension, when a mass murderer haunts a neighborhood for many weeks, picking out a victim here and one there, the question everybody wants answered is, who is the guilty one? When bad things happen, we all want to get to the bottom of the problem. But tracking evil to its origin is one of the most difficult undertakings ever. If we're not careful, we're going to fall into the same error of those disciples of Jesus. We may come up with two or more possible explanations, both of which are wrong. This morning I want us to look at these two choices that those disciples proposed. A man was born blind. Who's to blame? Now, honestly, how ridiculous can you get? Here's a man who had been blind from his birth, and those disciples were asking, is his blindness due to his own sin? Well, there were some theologians back in that day who had some rather weird ideas, such as prenatal sin. They believed that a person could sin while still in the mother's womb, or maybe sin during a pre-existence of the soul in some other form. I surely hope we would all reject those two notions today. What those disciples were really asking Jesus may have been more like, does the problem of suffering come from us as human beings? Aren't we often responsible for the mess we get ourselves into? The assumption here was that sin brings suffering. I'm sure we can all think of situations in which we can plainly see that sin can and does bring suffering. Many people make bad choices. Think of the trail of suffering which alcoholism brings. Senseless car wrecks, broken homes, cirrhosis of the liver, careless loss of money, loss of job, a sense of alienation from God, and that's just to name a few. Think of the suffering that is brought on by venereal disease, sexually transmitted disease, spread throughout our society by wrong sexual relationships. Think of all the suffering which is induced by the misuse of drugs, causing people to do all sorts of crazy things that no person in their right mind would ever think of doing. Think of all the crimes which are committed by those who are high on illicit drugs. A lot of the suffering which people do today is caused by willful sin. If you want to know why some people suffer, the place to look is in the mirror. In some ways, there is a cause and effect law in this universe. God has given us laws of nature which we cannot defy without penalty. For example, if we try to defy the law of gravity and we fall off a cliff, we may break some bones. If we step in front of a speeding car, God's natural law is not to blame. We are for violating the limits of our safety. God has given us these laws for our good, but if we violate them, then we can expect suffering to follow. When bad things happen, there are times when we can correctly attribute them to our own doing. I find it rather interesting that Jesus' disciples, though, began by asking if this man's trouble were caused by human responsibility. Most people, even in the Bible, start at the other end, the opposite end. They blame their misfortunes on God. Oh, you've heard many stories about primitive tribes who may assume that their misfortunes were to be traced to an angry God. If things were going right, the gods were happy. If things went wrong, then somebody had angered the gods, they thought. The Old Testament was a step above this kind of primitive thought. But even there, we find a sub-Christian kind of thought pattern which pictured God as a celestial judge who zapped people with thunderbolts when they sinned or blessed others when they pleased God. Go back and look again at the reasoning of Job's comforters. This is the kind of problem I was addressing 2 Sundays ago when I said that suffering is not always a direct result of sin. Those who think otherwise would say, well, God rules everything, therefore God's responsible for all of our suffering. When you suffer, it must be because you've done something to deserve this punishment from God. I disagree with the idea that God always gives us measure for measure. If you believe that, then you have to rule out completely the grace of God, which we know we have experienced through Jesus Christ. I am not willing to throw away God's amazing grace. Now, having said that, I would certainly say that there are those times when we do suffer because of certain wrong decisions we make. When we get outside of God's will for our lives, then we can expect the going to be pretty rough. Where do bad things come from? They can come from us as human beings when we're not true to God's clear will for our lives. Did this man sin in that he was born blind? Was that the reason? Sometimes we do bring suffering on ourselves, but this was not the case with this man in the Bible. And so we'll have to look at another possibility. This is one the disciples offered as a second alternative. What was that? Are this man's parents to blame? Now, maybe the reason this man was born blind can be traced to his parents, who sinned even before he was born, thought the disciples. In other words, is his predicament something that he inherited from the past? And we know that kind of thing can happen today. Parents can be sexually promiscuous The resulting sexually transmitted disease can leave a newborn baby blind. The parents sin, the child bears a penalty. There are times when children bear a terrible penalty which should be traced to their parents. Some children, for example, grow up without any kind of discipline. They're allowed to eat what they want, do what they please, go where they wish. These children become spineless in character. They grow up to be completely selfish. They marry somebody for what they can get out of the relationship. And then when divorce comes, they may wonder why things went wrong. But it's a pattern they've had since way back in their early childhood. They developed a style of life from their parents. Now, what is true on a personal level can also be true from the standpoint of communities or even nations. Some children receive an inferior education, and when times of testing come later in life, they're not able to get a promotion in business, or they're not capable of meeting some challenge which their company demands, and so they suffer the consequences. This is something which the children may not be directly responsible for, but something they could not avoid. Think back in our own nation's history, the nation of America. Think back to the time of the Civil War. It was a time when slavery was, in the eyes of many people, the accepted thing. Even today, there are those people, black and white, who are still suffering from that issue and who are still paying the consequences of that national problem, even though this happened long before they were born. Every child who is born comes into a world which is filled with problems, complex situations, and sin. We are not born with a clean slate, a new beginning, which had nothing to do with those who went before us. Rather, we all stepped into history like a person who steps into a muddy stream, which is carrying all the filth and debris which may have come from far upstream and people from an earlier generation. There's an old proverb in the Old Testament which describes this situation exactly. You can find it in Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 2. It says, "The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." God set forth this same idea back in the Ten Commandments. He said in Exodus 20, verse 5, "I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." Now, this way of God's doing things may seem very unfair to us, and yet, could we really restart history all over again with every new generation that comes along? Are there no roots? Can we wipe the slate clean? Of course not. This does not mean that God is punishing us for something we did not do. God's not holding a grudge against us. That would be just about as senseless as my punishing my child for something my grandfather did. But the problem still remains when we think of how some children are punished because of what their parents did. It just doesn't seem fair, does it? Think of all those little children who are born with some deformity which is caused by a sin on the part of their parents. Are this man's parents to blame that he was born blind? Asked the disciples. Sometimes this seems to be the case. Now, if you were God and you had the option of making things different, would you rule out this law of the passing on of bad things and suffering from one generation to another? Remember now, if we don't inherit the negative things from the past, then how can we expect to inherit the positive things? We have inherited from our forefathers things such as racial strife, emotional tension, national problems. But we have also inherited Shakespeare, Beethoven, Michelangelo, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford. If we had to start out with each new generation from ground zero, you would not be able to turn on your television because there wouldn't be one. And if you had a TV, then there'd be no electricity to run it. You might be able to come to a church, but not one that has beautiful architectural design and skill. People just didn't have that like we have today. Can you imagine young people trying to cruise the boulevard at Ocean Lakes or in Myrtle Beach on your horse? History comes to us with both the good and the bad. There's no way we can separate the two. If we want to inherit the good things from the past, then we must accept also those bad things. You see, it's a package deal. So the second question for us to ask is, when something bad happens in our lives, shall we say, has this come out of history? If it has, then our challenge is not to do the impossible and try to rewrite history, but rather we must address ourselves to the task of helping to reshape the future. We may not be able to undo all the past hundreds of years of conflict between Jews and Arabs, but we can do our small part in helping to send missionaries to those countries where the gospel of peace can be preached. We may not be able to solve all the racial problems of our forefathers, but we can demonstrate a positive Christian attitude toward those who are all around us who may still be hurting from the past. We can befriend those who may not be of our race, showing the same kind of love that Jesus showed, even to the hated Samaritans. We can cease to belittle people like our own Jewish neighbors, and we can begin showing kindness and love, expecting nothing in return except perhaps the knowledge inside that you're doing your small part to share the love of Jesus, your Savior, who was also a Jew, by the way. We may not be able to correct the ravages of alcoholism and everyone who's caught in the chains of slavery of alcohol, but we can begin to support those causes which come to our attention, which will help us to combat the constant spread of alcoholism and illegal drug abuse. We can also be willing to develop more wholesome, informed attitudes and the ways in which our efforts can turn the tide to prevent others from falling into this snare. No, we cannot rewrite history, but we can revitalize the present. Even though many poisons have been poured into the stream of history in the past, we can so live that our individual lives will pour into it from this place forward the love, the redemptive power, the transforming peace, which comes only through the one who is the Prince of Peace, Jesus. Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So asked the disciples. Jesus said that neither were to blame in this case. Well, that brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? And we still don't have the complete answer. Well, our business is not just to explain evil, but to defeat it, to overcome it. You remember Jesus did not say, I have explained the world. He did say, I have overcome the world. What if all the tragedies and catastrophes were looked upon as opportunities for God to work through us, to show what God could do? We may not be able to solve all the problems of the universe about who's to blame when suffering comes. But one thing we can do, we can reach out to someone who's hurting, and we can let Christ love them through us. Carl Menninger, famous psychiatrist, once gave a lecture on mental health and was answering questions from the audience. What would you advise a person to do, asked one man, if that person felt a nervous breakdown coming on? Well, most people expected this great psychiatrist to say, well, consult a psychiatrist. But to their astonishment, this great doctor replied, lock up your house, go across the railroad tracks, find somebody in need, and do something to help that person. Bob Hastings, in his book, Take Heaven Now, tells the story of a little girl who came home late one evening. Her mother scolded her and asked, where have you been? The little girl replied, "Janet, my friend, broke her doll." But the mother said with a stern voice, "But you could not help her fix it, could you?" "No, ma'am," she said to her mother, "but Janet was crying, and so I stopped to help her cry." We cannot always explain the origin of the trouble when bad things happen to good people. One thing we can do, though, by God's help, we can pray that we may become part of the answer instead of part of the problem. And God, that's our prayer right now, that we may become part of the answer to whatever problem is right before us. We pray with the help of Jesus, which is promised. Amen.